Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, what is on your mind post Thanksgiving?
I have been thinking a lot about this DOGE committee, the Department of Government Efficiency, that Elon Musk is running, along with Vivek Ramaswamy, another hanger on in the Trump world. That the two of them have been directed by Donald Trump to come up with a plan to radically restructure and downsize the federal government, to curtail a whole lot of rules, lay off a whole bunch of people, and save as much as $2 trillion from the federal budget. And I have been surprised, Tom, at how much compliance officers are watching this warily. I think that the impulse to restrict or simplify or make better efficiency at the federal government, that's fine. That's not anything new. Various administrations have tried to simplify and deregulate and improve efficiency for years. But the way that Elon Musk, and it's clearly him driving the train, the way that he is going about this and what he says are his ultimate ambitions, not just to cut the size of government, but then to keep it permanently small, that is something compliance officers need to watch, because you would have to think about, how would that actually work? Is it going to actually work? Spoiler, I think it won't. But even if it did, what would that mean for corporate organizations if the government suddenly started not either enforcing rules or just abolishing rules? And what happens with all of these risks that had been regulated before and now they're not? And they're not going to go away just because a regulation has gone away. So what would that mean for corporate risk management if the federal government suddenly started to cut loose a whole bunch of its risk management priorities for the previous, I don't know, many decades? And there's a lot to think about there.
Matt, can we start with the basics of how much of the federal budget is taken up by military, Social Security, and those types of programs, and how many people of the 2.3 million employed by the federal government are employed by the military or other similar essential services?
That's a very good place to start. And we should remember that Musk's broad goals here, and he laid them all out in an op-ed column in the Wall Street Journal, are to cut half of all regulations and then correspondingly cut half of all federal employees. He seems to think that there is a one-to-one correspondence here, that if you get rid of half the rules and just don't enforce them, you can get rid of half the employees who are supposed to enforce them. If you sit down then and do the math, that will not work on multiple levels. So out of the 2.3 million federal government employees, and people can look this up, the facts of it are not hard to find, 2.3 million federal government employees, 1.3 million of them are uniformed service personnel in the Defense Department. So soldiers, Air Force, Navy sailors, whatnot, Marines, I guess maybe the Space Force, but not even just Pentagon civilian employees. 1.3 million are uniformed soldiers and military personnel. That's more than half of 2.3 million right there. So if you got rid of half of all regulations and then got rid of half of all employees, by definition, you would have to cut into the 1.3 million soldiers and get rid of everything else, everybody else who works for the federal government. No FDA of any kind, no air traffic control of any kind, no NASA of any kind, no Justice Department, no court system, no Congress, no president, no White House staff, no anybody anywhere. And then you would still be short of the half of the personnel employees that you want to get rid of. Why is that? Simple. Because just because you get rid of half of all regulations, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can get rid of half of people enforcing them. The Defense Department has got a lot of rules and regulations, but it doesn't have half. If you got rid of all, say, half of all banking regulations, you couldn't get rid of half of all banking employees. A very few, small number of banking rules apply to an awful lot of banks. You still need a significant number of bank employees to go out, or banking regulator employees to go out and regulate the banks that are out there. There are several thousand banks in the United States. You could go on and on with this, that Clearly, we can't have no federal government. So you're going to wind up with some rules and regulations and some people in non-defense spending. And we haven't even touched the fact that you would also have a large number work for Veterans Affairs. So are we going to get rid of veteran doctors, nurses? Going to get rid of VA drug counselors? I mean, we're just not. Now, Tom, to your point about the 2 trillion in savings, that doesn't work either. The federal government, as of fiscal 2024, which ended its fiscal year in September, that total spending was about $6.7 trillion. I think I might have the exact number here somewhere. And therefore, if you want to cut 2 trillion, here we are. 6.75 trillion spent in fiscal 2024, 4.8 trillion went to Social Security, national defense, Medicare, which is healthcare for senior citizens, veterans benefits, and then covering the national debt, the interest on the national debt. 4.8 trillion of 6.75 trillion went to just those things. So if you the remainder, 1.95 trillion, is everything else. It's Congress, it's border security, it's border agents, it's diplomatic relations around the world, it's foreign consulates, it's Medicaid, it's aviation safety, it's food inspection, it's tax collection, it's sending rockets up to the space station. It's all sorts of stuff. And even if you got rid of all of that, you would cut only 1.95 trillion of federal spending, which is not the 2 trillion that Donald Trump and Elon Musk say that they're going to do. So you can't get what DOGE wants to do. You can't get there, period. You can't get there by cutting staff. There's not enough staff that are cuttable. You can't get there by cutting costs. There are not enough costs that are cuttable. There are plenty of ways that we could improve the efficiency of the federal government. Better procurement, more streamlined procurement rules, better IT, because we are working on antiquated IT in the federal government. There might be specific programs or missions that the government would want to step away from, but that actually is not necessarily something that the DOGE committee could do. It doesn't get to pass laws that say we're going to eliminate this or that. It is only Congress can do that. But Tom, that gets to the second half of what Elon Musk and Trump want to do. What they really want to do is just have some raw material of here's stuff we want to cut and abolish. Here are some missions we no longer want to do. And then I, Donald Trump, the executive, I'm going to decide not to spend money on that, period. I'm just going to act unilaterally. And can he do that? Would Congress take exception? Would Congress take exception to that because Congress had appropriated the money for these things? That's the fight that they want to have. And that's why Elon Musk is doing this. He's not doing it to cut government spending per se. If he can find some ways to streamline government, awesome. People have been trying that for the last 50 years. But really, it's more about proposing a radical downsizing and then giving Trump the cover to try and grab that authority away from Congress. That's what this is ultimately about.
So, Matt, I've been thinking about this topic and certainly read your blog post a couple of times. And what I guess maybe I have less concern than you do, or I see an alternative for the following reason. Many of the programs around compliance have become embedded as a part of business now. And if I take the energy industry as an example, the response to the first FCPA sweep through the energy industry was that the level of companies that had enforcement actions against them started to require their vendors and, of course, their agents on the sales side to go through the rigors of FCPA compliance, whether it was a third-party risk management program, whether it was auditing a vendor's compliance program. And this pushed compliance down the chain. You've seen that in other areas now, I think, as well, tech, healthcare, et cetera, as the DOJ sweeps to the industries. But then we began to see insurance companies start to ask about compliance programs. We started to see investors, whether it was private equity, whether it was an individual investor, whether it was a hedge fund, whether it was CalPERS, started to look at whether a company had a compliance program, and they actually audited those programs. So it's a long-winded way of saying I saw a lot of B2B responds to the enforcement actions we saw in the first and second decades of this year. So that in many ways, compliance is embedded in these companies, and companies are looking at and to each other for these issues. So on one level, I think compliance itself has become so embedded that compliance is not going to go away, even if Elon Musk tries to make it go away. But the second thing is, and this is the takeaway I took from your blog post, there's no answer right now, guys, but start thinking about it. Can I ask you to respond to one or both of those?
I think that's true. There are a lot of issues that need to be unpacked here that I have no doubt to some extent, some of the ideas that the DOGE committee is going to put forth will come to pass. And some of them might actually be good ideas that should come to pass. If they want to streamline procurement or IT systems to make them more modern and efficient, great. I think that's excellent. But what might happen is something like they're going to say, we will no longer enforce wage and hour laws. And Donald Trump is just going to say, yeah, that sounds great. I'm the chief executive. I'm in charge of the executive branch. The executive branch enforces wage and hour. We're just not going to do it. And what would then happen? And what I worry about is a lot of executives might then hear that at a surface level and think, awesome, now I don't really have to keep track of all the paperwork. And maybe some unscrupulous people will think that is a green light to start substandard pay for some of their employees or to violate various other wage and hour laws and things like that. The operations people and the senior management will hear no more regulatory enforcement. They will then think, now we can do whatever we want and we can downsize and ignore the compliance team. That is a grave misreading of reality, I think. Tom, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of what had been compliance requirements from the federal government 20 years ago have become baked into the process now. And I don't love the phrase compliance inertia, but there's a compliance infrastructure and apparatus that exists at that B2B level that everybody still wants to make sure the third parties I deal with, they're not doing something wrong that might somehow contaminate my own operations. And the way you investigate the potential of contamination, the way you rectify it is with a compliance and an audit program. So that's still going to happen. But, I still also am concerned about, let's go back to the wage and hour issue. Let's say Trump decides he's not going to enforce that anymore, and he tries to abolish funding for the National Labor Relations Board, which is something he might try to do. And then what happens if federal enforcement of wage and hour laws goes away? It's not like equal pay or fair pay risk goes away. You would still have a lot of state regulators, at least 50 of them, if not more, who would also be looking at enforcing their own wage and hour laws. You might have civil litigation that might come up. You might have unwanted publicity if somebody is exposed, if your company's exposed as using people in forced labor or, substandard or sub-minimum wage hours or wages for employees. There's all sorts of ways it could still be a mess. And that's the point that I want to emphasize here is just because the federal government decides to abdicate its role in managing a risk, that doesn't mean that the risk goes away. The risk is transformed. Another bright idea is that they might eliminate CISA. So that is the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency. It is the chief internet security regulator for the United States. It doesn't even really regulate. It doesn't pass rules that to be enforced. It passes guidelines and whatnot. But Republicans are talking about getting rid of CISA. And here's the part that would have CISOs breathing into a paper bag, delegating cybersecurity requirements back to the states. So instead of having one standard for critical infrastructure cybersecurity, you'd have 50, just like we do with privacy. I have never met any privacy officer who says, that's great. What we really need is 50 individual state level laws, not a federal privacy law. Nobody has ever said that in the world. And yet, that might be the sort of thing that comes to pass if we decide that we're not going to fund CISA anymore. There are various other ways that, we could see emerging risks that the federal government is just going to say, we're not going to address that. I am all for allowing some amount of risk in the free enterprise system. That's how you grow. That's how you innovate. That's how you make money. But if you take a sort of blind approach to that and just say, we're not going to ever consider any new emerging risks ever, I like, how is a company supposed to survive that? Because if the federal government doesn't stand to state a floor for how we will manage a risk, other parties are going to try and force you to adhere to their interpretations of that instead. Might be states, might be private litigation, it might be shareholder groups, and it could lead to a lot of chaos and confusion and uncertainty, which I think is probably the most likely outcome from the DOGE committee. Some minor successes on making more efficient government operations, a whole lot of chaos and uncertainty, a lot of litigation, but there will be a population out there who thinks the federal government said they're not going to do it anymore. So I don't need to worry about that risk anymore. And I don't need to fund the compliance function to care about that risk anymore. Right? Wrong. That is a very myopic, foolhardy approach to how to respond to all of this.
I certainly agree, and I really like the way you laid out the number of other risks that are or will continue to exist no matter what happens with the DOGE Commission. But could I take it a step further, or maybe even a step in a different direction? How about, or how should companies and compliance functions think about the increase in regulatory or enforcement action that we will no doubt see from the Trump administration in the area of trade sanctions or export controls or those sorts of potential areas, China, Latin America, you name the country that Donald Trump happens to be pissed off at that particular day? And how do compliance professionals think about having a framework to answer both of the questions we posed? Number one, what happens if everything gets cut from the federal government? But number two, what happens when it exponentially increases?
Nobody knows. And that is, I think, the inherent problem and challenge with the Trump administration is the arbitrary approach to governance that Donald Trump himself takes. Let's not forget that either just before Thanksgiving or on Thanksgiving Day, he suddenly announced that he was ready to impose tariffs on Mexico and China. And then he had a phone call with Mexico, and Justin Trudeau flew down from Ottawa to Mar-a-Lago and they had dinner. And now everything's great. And now I guess we're not going to have tariffs, but maybe we will. I don't know. And that's going to be the inherent problem. And so if senior management comes to your tax compliance team and says, how are we going to address the potential for tariff risk? Nobody has any idea. Nobody has any idea from day to day what Donald Trump wants to do. And even the Trump team itself has said that nothing is true until Donald Trump personally announces it, I guess by his tweets or Truth Social or whatever he calls it. But this is no way to run a railroad. But nonetheless, this is the railroad that we are now on. And we will have to wait an awful lot. You can get a good sense of the most fundamental sort of things that might change. Tom, you're correct that I think sanctions enforcement will go up. But again, so if we're cutting half of the Justice Department or the new AG and FBI nominees are going to retask everybody to chasing down undocumented migrants, like, again, how does this work? You actually need lawyers to enforce sanctions. So you're going to have to get them from somewhere. Or are you just going to talk about it? Companies will need to respond in some sort of theoretical way to build up a good sanctions compliance team, but you're never going to know if you actually will ever face a sanctions violation. Even if you know you're committing them, you don't know that there are any lawyers who are ever going to call you. You could even try self-reporting, and then the lawyer says, yeah, thanks. I'll get back to you when I'm done with my 588 illegal immigration cases. And suddenly it's 2029 before you ever get a reply to your self-disclosure. Like, we have no idea how this is going to work on a systematic way. And I don't have a good answer for compliance officers, but obviously seizing on the idea that Trump says we're not going to do much anymore, so I guess we don't have to have a compliance program, don't have to care about risks. That can't be right. That is a foolhardy way to do it. And eventually, if you tap dance through that landmine approach long enough, you will step on the wrong landmine. It will blow up. And then somebody somewhere will sue you. I don't know who, but this is America. You do get sued when you make a mistake if you're a corporation. So like that's, I don't know. That, like I said, there's no easy answers here because there's no coherence on the other side to try and fashion a response to it.
I guess you have to have a question if you have an answer.
Yes.
I think we're going to get to revisit this one, Matt.
All right, Tom. Thank you very much.